South Africa's absence from one of the world's most powerful global gatherings is raising questions, but the presidency says there is no snub, no crisis, and no cause for alarm. President Cyril Ramaphosa will not attend the upcoming G7 summit in France, and according to officials, the reasons are both diplomatic and structural. The G7 summit, scheduled for June 2026 in Evian-les-Bains, brings together the world's leading industrialized economies, including the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, and Canada. South Africa, however, is not a member of this group. Speaking on the matter, President Ramaphosa made it clear that South Africa's absence should not be interpreted as a rejection or exclusion. He emphasized that being attendance at the summit is based on invitation, and not all countries are invited every year. In his words, being absent from the summit should not surprise anyone, noting that South Africa has attended in the past only when invited by the host nation. Here's what that means for South Africans. The G7 is not a permanent platform for South Africa. Unlike the G20 or BRICS, where South Africa is a formal member, participation in the G7 depends entirely on the host country's diplomatic priorities. But behind this explanation lies a more complex global context. Recent reports suggest that diplomatic tensions may have also played a role in the decision not to include South Africa this year. According to multiple reports, there were claims that pressure from the United States influenced the invitation process, with suggestions that Washington could have objected to South Africa's presence. However, French officials have strongly denied that South Africa was excluded due to external pressure, stating that the selection of guest countries was a collective decision. Instead, countries such as India, Brazil, South Korea, and Kenya have been invited as guest participants this year. Experts say this reflects shifting geopolitical priorities. France, as the host nation, is reportedly focusing on strengthening ties with specific regions, particularly in Africa, where Kenya has been invited ahead of planned diplomatic engagements. At the same time, global tensions are influencing international forums. Relations between South Africa and the United States have been strained in recent years, particularly over foreign policy differences and Pretoria's stance on global conflicts. These tensions have already been visible in previous international events, including diplomatic disagreements and boycotts linked to major summits. But the presidency is taking a measured tone. Government spokespersons have indicated that South Africa respects the host country's decision and remains committed to engaging with global partners through other platforms. And, importantly, South Africa is still actively involved in major global forums that directly impact its economy and foreign policy. Experts warn that focusing too narrowly on the G7 could miss the bigger picture. South Africa's global influence is not defined by a single summit, one analyst explained. It operates within multiple international platforms where its voice remains significant. Here's what that means in practical terms. South Africa continues to play a key role in the G20, which includes major emerging economies, the BRICS bloc, which focuses on cooperation among developing nations, and regional African structures, including the African Union. These platforms often have a more direct impact on South Africa's economic and political priorities than the G7. Still, the optics matter. Opposition voices and some analysts argue that absence from high-profile global meetings can affect perceptions of influence and diplomatic standing. However, others argue that South Africa's independent foreign policy, including its positions on global conflicts and international law, may naturally lead to tensions with some Western powers. And that brings us to a key point. South Africa's foreign policy approach has increasingly focused on non-alignment, multilateralism, and advocating for the global South. This positioning has strengthened relationships with some partners while complicating relations with others. So what happens next? The upcoming G7 summit will proceed without South Africa's participation, but that does not mean the country is stepping back from global engagement. Instead, attention is likely to shift to other key platforms where South Africa continues to play a central role, particularly in shaping economic cooperation, development policy, and global governance debates. And, perhaps most importantly, the situation highlights how global diplomacy is evolving. Invitations, alliances, and participation are no longer just about economic power, but also about political alignment, strategic interests, and international relationships. As South Africa navigates this complex landscape, one thing remains clear: its global role is changing, but it is far from diminished.